Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. This is episode number 368, and I'm your host, Andrew Schultz. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about what to do about a hoarding tenant, how far in advance you should renew a lease, and what to do when someone wants to rent an apartment sight unseen. We'll get to all that right after this.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. Now your host, Andrew Schultz.
Before we jump into today's episode, don't forget to check out the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group. It's a great free resource for you to network with housing providers from around the country, and if you have a question or a situation that you've never dealt with over 12,500 members, chances are someone in the group has been there before and can lend a helping hand. Our goal is to hit 13,000 people by January 1st, so if you haven't checked it out yet, do it today over at facebook.com/groups/rentprep. Don't forget to mention the podcast when answering the questions so we know how you found us.
Forum Quorum, where we scour the internet for ridiculous posts from landlords and tenants.
So we've got a real doozy for you to start off with Forum Quorum. If you've ever watched any reality television, chances are you've come across an episode of Hoarders at some point. But what happens when you wind up with a hoarder inside one of your rentals? So that's what we're talking about here in Forum Quorum. This one comes to us via the landlord subreddit. We're going to go ahead and jump right in here. I need some advice on how to proceed with a hoarding tenant. I recently did some maintenance in her apartment for the first time in years to discover mountains of junk, boxes, etc. The whole apartment is just a wreck. There's a enough space to walk from the door to the bathroom and bed, but that's about it. At the time, I was a first-time homeowner with a separate apartment on my property, so I did not cover my bases when we signed the lease. The original lease has since expired, and I've lost that paperwork, and the tenant is now month to month. We're considering taking the property off the rental market for the time being to renovate the building. My concerns are for the property itself, as it is definitely being neglected. I'm wondering how I can go about getting this tenant out of my property legally. And again, this one comes to us via Reddit. So this is actually one of the reasons that I recommend regularly inspecting your rental units. As a matter of fact, I think it's critical to inspect your rental units at least once every 6 months or so, because it cuts stuff like this off before it ever has a chance to really take hold. Not to mention, doing maintenance on a hoarder's unit can be challenging at best and downright dangerous at worst. So when you do those regular inspections, that's a good way to try to cut something like this off before it really has an opportunity to take hold of the unit. Hoarders can cause a ton of damage to properties. First, you have the weight of the hoard. This can be a really substantial impact on the structure of the property, depending on the weight of everything. And a couple of examples that I always think of are, first off, newspapers. You know, a stack of newspaper doesn't seem like much, but newspaper stacks get very, very heavy very, very quickly. And now imagine an entire room filled with those stacks. It's a ton of weight to put on the structure of a building. Another good example is water. A gallon of water weighs 8 pounds. It's not light. And if you have a ton of liquids in containers, and if you've watched any footage of hoarder houses, I think you can kind of read between the lines and understand what I mean here. If you have a bunch of containers of liquid sitting around, that has a lot of weight to it as well, not to mention all of the ancillary things that go along with that. If you have large amounts of waste in the house, they did mention in the original question some pet waste and things of that nature. You could also wind up with human waste if plumbing stops working and someone doesn't get called in to repair it, things of that nature. You know, it's a lot of factors to consider there when it comes to not just the occupant, but the contents of the property when you're dealing with a situation like this. Structures are built to accommodate certain weight loads and certain pressures and things like that. And having a house full of stuff can really cause issues that way. In addition, there's obviously concerns about whatever they're hoarding being hazardous, or can it become hazardous over time? Keep in mind that if this is something that's been going on for years, containers will degrade, they'll leak, they'll break over time. If you have somebody that's housing something as simple as cleaning chemicals, you mix the wrong cleaning chemicals and you have a really, really nasty situation on your hands. So, this is definitely not something that is a situation that can be ignored. It definitely needs to be addressed. All of that said, hoarding is considered a mental illness. There are programs that can try to help people who are hoarders, which sounds like it would probably be appropriate here. Realistically, I think this person needs access to some sort of social services. There may be family members or friends that can help you. Or failing that, you may be able to reach out to your local government to find some resources to help through Department of Social Services or Office of Mental Health, something along those lines. As for getting control of the unit again, that's going to be another ballgame. Different states are going to have different eviction and displacement laws, and typically you're going to start by providing notice to the tenant in line with whatever your state's guidelines are, that you're terminating their tenancy effective whatever date, because this tenant is month to month. My recommendation here is that you terminate because you want to renovate. If you have to list a reason on your termination letter, you're terminating the lease because you want to renovate the apartment. And then it's a waiting game to see if the tenant moves out or not. If not, you're moving on to a holdover eviction, and you're definitely going to want to get an attorney here for some more assistance. They're going to be able to help you through that process a lot easier than I can do in just a couple minutes on a podcast. Assuming the tenant does move out, you're likely going to be left with a ton of personal possessions that you may need to hold for some period of time before you're able to dispose of. Again, check your state laws, or alternatively, get the tenant to sign off on the disposal, which, I mean, obviously may be easier said than done, especially if you're dealing with somebody who this is their hoard, this is their life. They may not want to sign off on something like that. So you will have an uphill battle. There's no may about it. You will have an uphill battle ahead of you for this. So as an option of last resort, you may want to reach out to building department, health department, fire department to help you. But if you reach out to them for assistance, the chances are they're going to wind up condemning the building. And at that point, it sounds like, number one, you're still living in half of this building, so that might be part of the issue. But realistically speaking, if they condemn the building, they're probably going to require you to bring that building up to compliance to get a certificate of occupancy again. So you may be opening the door to code issues or updates that you need to do that you weren't planning on doing, whatever the case may be. Again, getting the agencies involved that are going to condemn the property is an absolute last resort. I think your best case scenario here is that the tenant moves at the end of their, termination notice. That would be the absolute best case scenario. Otherwise, I think things are going to get tricky. You're probably going to need to get an attorney to assist you through the process. You may have to, in the worst case scenario, seek some sort of a roundabout solution with getting a building condemned or something like that. Obviously, we've already said that's not the best solution for a variety of reasons. At the end of the day, there's a ton of nuance here. There's a lot in landlording that isn't black and white, just simply isn't. There's a lot of nuance to this business. Striking a balance between being good to your fellow human being and looking out for your own best interests as the property owner can be conflicting. And this is a situation that calls for compassion just as much as it calls for resolution, and you have to work toward both in this scenario. Good luck to you, and send us an update.
Water cooler wisdom. Expert advice from real estate pros.
We have two really good water cooler wisdoms for you this week. Our first one comes to us via the Landlord subreddit, and it's all about lease expirations. Let's go ahead and jump right in here. I have two single-family residences in which the leases expire March 1st, 2022. When should I contact the tenants in terms of signing for another year? Is it too early now? So just for a little context, in case you're listening to the back catalog, this episode is going to come out at the end of December 2021. So effectively, we're talking about a little over 2 months. We'd have January and February with the lease expiring March 1st of 2022, just for context purposes. As with so many of our questions, this one starts with a very, very simple statement. Check your state laws. Different states are going to have different rules on how much notice you need to give when changing the rent or terminating a tenancy, etc. In some states, non-renewal isn't always an option, especially if the state has just cause legislation for terminating leases. And if you're not familiar with that, just cause laws state that the landlord cannot terminate a tenancy for any reason except for certain circumstances. So once you've leased to a tenant, they have possession pretty much indefinitely of that unit until you can evict them for non-payment or for a just cause, or they leave of their own accord. Some states will have just cause eviction laws, some will not. You're going to want to check your state laws so you understand what you're dealing with in that regard. So here in New York, we have to give 30, 60, or 90 days notice if we intend to vacate the unit or increase the rent by 5% or more. And this is based on the length of the tenancy. Because we're working on a maximum of 90-day window, if we intend to do a non-renewal or bump the rent up, we start our process at 120 days out, a full 4 months ahead of the lease end date. So what we're doing in that first month is internally, we're making decisions on if we even want to extend a lease renewal because we don't have just cause eviction laws here in New York yet. And if we are going to extend that lease renewal, we're determining what the rent rate's going to be for that next lease period and how long that lease period is going to be. Typically for us, that's going to be 1 year. So at that point, once we've decided whether or not we're going to offer that tenant lease renewal and determine what the rent rate's going to be, we'll approach the tenant either giving them their non-renewal notice or saying, hey, we'd like to renew you for, another 1 year lease term. We're going to bump the rent up by, whatever percentage or whatever the case. Your new rent's going to be X. We need to know by no later than X date what your plan is for the unit. If we don't hear from you, we will remarket the unit as though it's going to be reoccupied at the end of your lease term. And then what we do is essentially give the tenant time to make their decision. We always try to give them as much time as possible to determine whether or not they're planning on staying with us or if they're going to move on to another apartment. But we do try to give them as much opportunity as possible because we know that it takes time to think these things through, find another place, et cetera, et cetera. So if we're getting to the point where we're approaching the deadline for when we need to know if they're planning on renewing or not, and they haven't given us any indication, we will usually issue the non-renewal notice, even if we think that that tenant plans on renewing. Why would we do that? Well, it spurs action. When a tenant gets a non-renewal notice and they plan on renewing, you're going to get a phone call or a text message or an email or whatever right away. They're going to be like, hey, what the heck's going on? I thought we were going to stay for another year. You can always rescind a notice, but you can't issue a notice in the past, if that makes sense. So we would rather be ahead of the game. We'll issue the notice. We can always rescind it if the tenant decides that they want to renew. But if we wait until, the day after that notice has to be served to go into effect, guess what? In New York, we're waiting a full 30 days before that notice goes into effect now. And we've now cost ourselves 30 days in this already too long timeline. So we try to be on top of that sort of thing and get those notices out the door before the deadline just to keep the timeline as tight as possible. If we get to that 30-day point and the notice is issued and the tenant has either not communicated or has decided they're moving on, at that point, we begin marketing the property and go from there. You may also have some special circumstances that determine when your lease renewal should be completed. So for instance, we used to manage a large number of student rentals, mostly single family and duplex homes, kind of surrounding one of the local college campuses. The students would typically start looking to secure their fall semester housing as soon as they came back from winter break. So we're talking like January, February, they're looking for their housing for August of the following year. Based on that, we would start asking about everybody's plans at the end of October or beginning of November, which is crazy because most of these leases just started in August. So you're barely unpacked. And now we want to know if you're sticking around for another year or not. So the nice thing with students was that many of them stayed for, several years. And if someone was moving or graduating, a lot of times the rest of the students in the house that were staying would already have a friend lined up that wanted that room. So at that point, it would just be a matter of doing some tenant screening and then going from there. This may also be something that you can handle right in your lease. In the past, we've used a lease clause that automatically renewed the lease for an additional year with an increase in rent if the tenant didn't let us know if they were planning on staying or going prior to the final month of their lease agreement. Some states do and some states don't allow for this type of lease language. This is definitely something that you're going to want to run by your attorney to be sure of before you put it in place, particularly because the language can have some impact in how things are worded. And in addition to that, this could have an impact on other areas of your operation based off of these timelines. So you're going to want to run that by an attorney if that's something that you want to pursue. But my recommendation would be find out what the guidelines are in your state and then build your timeline based off of that timeline so that you're always staying one step ahead of the game. Our second water cooler wisdom also comes to us via the landlord subreddit, and this one is interesting because it's a topic that doesn't come up super frequently, but every once in a while you just need to know how to handle a unique situation. In this instance, it's someone that's relocating from one state to another and trying to secure a rental. Let's go ahead and jump right in. I'm a first-time landlord, and I have an interested candidate that is relocating from Florida to Washington and is interested in a sight unseen rental. I've just started asking them questions regarding the cause of the relocation and their source of income, plus I'll do a full review of their application information if we proceed, but I'm curious for any experiences or stories from the group about this type of situation, any important steps that I shouldn't forget, and is there anything that I need to add to the lease agreement in order to cover myself? Thank you in advance. So, as far as the tenant screening goes, you're going to want to treat them the exact same way that you would any other applicant. So, when it comes to verifying income, you're going to have a few different scenarios that you may encounter here. Scenario one would be that they are staying with the same company, but they're just transferring, and that transfer is taking them to a new state. Chances are they're going to have a letter for that transfer that can be verified with a human resources department, and they're probably going to have pay stubs to verify that they work at the company now. So you might be able to actually verify things a couple different ways there. This may just be a promotion or something similar, so there might be a pay bump that you wouldn't see in the existing pay stubs, but it should give you at least a good basis for what it is that you're looking at, and this is assuming they're staying with the same company. These are the easiest ones to verify because it's just a continuation of existing employment. Scenario two is that they are moving and starting with a new company. So typically in situations like this, they're going to get an offer letter, and we're going to verify the authenticity of the offer letter from the company that issued the letter, essentially. Applicants are going to ask about submitting incomes for their current job. That's fine. It shows that they have employment right now, but you're not going to be able to use that for income verification because they're moving from one state to another and they're taking a new job. So it's not like that income is going to be around any longer. That income source is effectively useless for screening purposes other than to know that they're employed right now. But as far as for future employment, that serves you essentially no purpose there. You're going to have some sort of an offer letter showing that they have that employment secured in the state that they're moving to. Scenario three for us is somebody with a large amount of savings but not a regular income. And in that scenario, we typically will look for 12 months of bank statements showing 12 full months of rent on deposit for the entire duration. For us, that's sort of the Hail Mary pass for income verification. If you can't figure out any other way to show us that you have income, show us you have a lot of savings. And I don't think that we've ever actually had to use that as the final straw to verify someone, but we do have it as an option if somebody really can't find any other way of showing that they have income. And trust me, we have plenty of ways to verify income. So I think that's probably the reason we've never made it all the way down the food chain to that last one. It is an option. If somebody wants to go that route, like that is an option, but it's typically, like I said, it's a Hail Mary, it's a last resort for us. As for the other two scenarios, you're basically going to be looking for a job offer letter. We verify these letters for authenticity, and when we do that, we look for a few different things. First, we want the letter on a company letterhead. I don't want just an email or something like that. I want an official letter on company letterhead. The letter must have a date that the employment offer was extended. Should also have the start date of the new employment and the base income for the position. We also want to know if that's going to be a permanent or a temporary position. So if this is a contract position and the contract is only 6 months long, I'm not going to extend the lease past the end of that employment contract because you have a known end date for their income source. Like, it's not very often that you know when someone's no longer going to have the money to pay your rent. When you do have that, make sure that you use that knowledge correctly and say, okay, well, I know that you have a 6-month contract. I can only extend you a 6-month lease. You can always extend it down the road with verification of continuation of contract or whatever the case may be, but protect yourself. Don't overextend yourself to someone who only has a fixed amount of income for a fixed period of time. Make sure that you're working with somebody that you have a full-time permanent position, or limit your risk in those scenarios. So in addition to all that, we do verify these letters with the company that issues it by contacting the HR department whenever possible. Be cautious about using the name or phone number on the letter. Google and call the main switchboard. A lot of times you'll find that you might get an offer letter and it might be signed by a supervisor or a coworker or a friend or something like that. Someone who's trying to put the best foot forward for this particular candidate, or maybe you've got falsified information. You just don't know. The best way to try to verify one of these letters is Google the company's name, find the main switchboard number, and call and talk to somebody in human resources that way. Depending on the size of the company, obviously, it might be something where you only have 3 or 4 people in the company and you're going to talk to the owner and they're going to verify the information. It may be a situation like that, but typically when you're talking about a state-to-state transfer, more than likely it's going to be a larger company and they're going to have human resources departments that deal with this kind of stuff all the time. So anyway, back to the main question, which was about the risk of sight unseen rentals. Now that we've talked about the screening side of it, what about the risk of a sight unseen rental? There are risks, and you have to decide if the risks are worth it to you. if you want to rent to someone who hasn't seen the unit or not. I don't know of any law in any state that says that you must rent to someone who hasn't seen the unit, so long as one of your criteria is that every applicant must see the unit. So if you may need to add that to your written criteria if you don't want to rent sight unseen and you don't already have that in your criteria, but that would give you almost an immediate out in these scenarios. Hi, I want to rent the apartment sight unseen. I'm sorry, our selection criteria state that you must see the apartment prior to putting in your application or prior to signing your lease or whatever the case may be. So that is an option. As far as I know, and I could be proven wrong, laws change all the time. I don't personally know of any laws that prohibit you from renting the apartment to someone because they don't have the ability to come out and physically see the unit. The main concerns here always seem to be what happens if they don't like the unit or they don't like the area or whatever the case after they move in, or what if they never take possession of the unit at all. My recommendation here is twofold. Number one, have a lease addendum for renting sight unseen or not taking possession of the unit. The addendum needs to clearly state that the unit is being rented sight unseen and that the tenant accepts the risks associated with that. And if they don't take possession or are unhappy and they want to move out, there need to be penalties outlined in that addendum to compensate you as the landlord for the lost marketing time and the lost rental income. This is something I strongly recommend that you have an attorney assist you with, as the language can get very, very, very tricky depending on your state's laws. And this is not something where you want to be starting into a 6-month-long argument with somebody when they want out and you just want a tenant that's going to continue to rent the unit and continue to pay the rent. My second recommendation here would be maybe you can have a friend or a coworker or someone that they're going to be living with, once they move to the area, walk through the unit on their behalf, and they can do a Zoom call or a video or whatever they want to do to try to alleviate the concerns of the individual who is going to be renting the unit sight unseen. I would still have that addendum in place regardless, but you might be able to parlay some of those concerns just by either having good videos or photos yourself, or by having that person send someone on their behalf to walk through or whatever the case may be. There's options out there for people who are looking to rent sight unseen. You just have to know what your risk tolerance is and what your policies are going to be when it comes to dealing with people that want to rent sight unseen, and then whether or not that's something that you want to deal with at all. Right now, rental references are a crucial part of the application process, especially with the recent rise in fraud. Our latest post on the blog will give you the lowdown on how to write a reference letter for tenants and even includes a free template for you to start customizing. You can check that out today over at rentprep.com/blog. That pretty much wraps things up for this episode of the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. Thank you all so much for listening. We truly do appreciate it. Our goal with the podcast is to help as many people as possible make educated decisions when it comes to real estate, and you can help us to reach our goal. If you heard anything in this week's episode or any other episode that will help someone you know, do us a favor and share it with them. If you're looking to get in contact with me, I can be reached over at whatsdrewupto.com, and from there you'll find links to everything going on with me over at Own Buffalo, as well as other projects that we're working on. We just launched a free investment property deal analyzer, which is available on that site, whatsdrewupto.com. It is completely free. There's no obligation whatsoever, and I also have a companion video that goes along with that, teaching you how I analyze deals and how to use our analyzer. I actually do a live deal analysis in that video for a listing that I had a few months back. It's really interesting to see how we break those deals down. If you're looking for top-tier tenant screening services, head on over to rentprep.com. There are multiple products to choose from, including a tenant paid option. And if you're over $50, ask about the enterprise level programs and pricing. I've been an enterprise user at RentPrep for years now, and it's definitely changed the way that we screen our tenants. Check that out today over at rentprep.com. Again, thank you all so much for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with an all-new episode you won't want to miss. Until then, I'm Andrew Schultz with ownbuffalo.com for rentprep.com, and we'll talk to you soon.